Well, I said last night we would deal with the idea of worship and service this evening, and that's all right. Jim, come on, don't worry about the camera. We're not being too formal in here.
We've already got you on anyway.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. If they can get me on that camera, they can get you on there. We wanted to deal with the idea this evening of worship as compared with service. And this is where I think that we have a lot of rumblings in today's church. And it's more and more all the time. And see, when one person starts something, another person picks up on it and he thinks, hey, that sounds pretty good. And he starts teaching and it just kind of spreads around like that. I think I know where it got started. Now, somebody may find something that dates prior to this, but a friend of mine, at least he was a friend back when we were acquainted. I haven't seen him in a long time. He wrote a series of articles in the Firm Foundation. Let's see what the date is here. March of 73. He wrote a series of 7 articles, and I believe it was 7. And he took the position that everything you do to God is worship. Everything you do in service to God is worship. And I want to read to you just a few little excerpts here. There's a whole lot to this, and I've redlined it all over the place. But I'm just going to read a small portion of this to give you an idea of what he's saying. Part of this, I read part of this first statement the first night, and as I thought about it later, I really didn't begin quite up as far as I should have to really get the whole thought that he was presenting about Jesus and the Samaritan woman. In John 4, he says, Jesus' conversation with the woman at the well in Samaria introduced the new and revolutionary concept of worship that is presented in the New Testament. See, the new and revolutionary. That's why I was saying all that about new and revolutionary the other night. Worship in the New Age is not to be limited as to time or place as it was under God's former arrangement, but rather encompasses the worshiper's total life and relationship with God. Now see, big difference between now and under Judaism. Now let's see. Let me read another one here. That was in his second installment, I think. In his third installment, he said, worship in the New Age is not to be associated merely with special acts limited by place or time, but rather encompasses the whole of the true worshiper's relationship and service to God. The words for worship, although borrowed from Jewish and pagan contexts of formal ceremonial temple worship, whenever applied to Christians, refer without exception not to a worship service, but rather to a life of service. See there? Now, let's see. I have one more, but I think I'll wait on it and read you something else instead. And here's another fellow. I think this second fellow picked up on the first one's material because the similarities are just too noticeable. And by the way, I was in the mission field in Beirut and in 72 to 75, and while I was there, this first writer that I'm quoting was in Athens, Greece. And we would see each other at Mediterranean lectureships. We went to the same college. I think he was a year or maybe 2 years ahead of me. And we somehow ended up overseas about the same time, and I got his material before it ever came out in the Firm Foundation from his co-worker, who was also a schoolmate of ours. And his co-worker, both of them working in Athens, he said, I'm worried about this. He said, I don't know where it's going. I want to know where he's going to end up. That's what he was concerned about. And, well, I was concerned about it too. And I think I see where it's ending up now that all this time has come about. I don't know if the initial writer here ever changed his mind or not. I sent him some material of my own several years ago, and I think it was in 83 I presented some material here on this lectureship on this subject. And I sent him the written material that appeared in the book and asked him if he would take a look at it and tell me where he would disagree with it. Never heard from him, so I don't know if he still agrees with what he wrote or not. But anyway, another fellow picked up on it. Here's another fellow in Texas. And he, the first one is in Texas too, right over here in this general area. The second one asserted that the worship terminology of the New Testament is applied to all areas of ministry and service. He said, you see, wherever you are, there is a temple because Christians are temples of God. You're the temple of God, and wherever you are, there's a priest on the scene because you are a royal priest of God. Now, wherever you have that combination, a temple where God is present and where there's a priest on the scene, not only can worship occur, but when you have that combination, worship must occur. Not only can it, but it must. See? Well, we're in the temple, we're in the church, in other words. We're a priest all the time, therefore we worship all the time. See? Now, you see, it's a logical argument, supposedly. It's not a scriptural argument, necessarily. I mean, he's taking some scriptural facts and constructing what seems to him a logical argument based on those scriptural facts. Then another writer came out in a commentary that he wrote. This is, again, another brother of ours. And he said, worship is as broad as the Christian life. The man who lawfully offers to God what pleases God is worshiping God. He said, involved in that life of worship is paying debts, providing for one's family, doing good, as well as other items that he mentioned. And then he went so far as to speak of playing golf, brushing one's teeth, washing one's hands, and the like. And he said, I don't see any difficulty in getting it into worship. Then he said, worship is the conscious giving to God in a pleasing way that which is pleasing to Him. It's pleasing, he said, it's pleasing to God for a group of saints in social merriment to beat the brains out of a piano to show me the way to go home. Song title. Isn't it? He said. He said, if the saint can pleasingly offer the activity to the Lord, he is worshiping the Lord. In that song, see?
Well, now, do they assemble together to worship?
Well, no, he doesn't like to use that terminology. And by the way, on that song, I wouldn't have picked that song if I was trying to make out this case. You know, I would have picked maybe Three Blind Mice or Home on the Range or something else, but this song, I had a little drink about an hour ago, and it went right to my head or through my head or something like that. I don't know if he knew about that second verse. But at any rate, you see, now the first two men that I quoted, I think they're saying anything you do in service to God or that particularly involves your relationship to God, that's worship. Whereas the third one now is saying everything, brushing your teeth, you see, changing your clothes, anything, mowing the grass, anything you do is worship. Because you're doing it 24 hours a day, nonstop, every second of the day, whether you're awake or asleep. So, I would simply say, initially, it is not true that all of a Christian's service to God is worship. The Bible carefully distinguishes between worship and service. And the explanation I like to use is that all worship is service, but not all service is worship. You see, one is a smaller part of the broader picture. Worship is a small part of the broader picture of service. All worship is service, but not all of this service is that narrow item of worship. Now, in the Bible, there are words used to indicate worship. And there's one primary word in the Old Testament and one primary word in the New Testament. Remembering now that the Old Testament has Hebrew and in some places Aramaic, and in the New Testament it's Greek. But 170 times in the Old Testament you have a Hebrew word that is pronounced. Now remember, I used to live over in Middle East for a while, but I took some Hebrew before that but I didn't learn how to pronounce those Hebrew words till I got over to the Middle East and tried to learn Arabic, and then I found out you better get the pronunciation right or they won't understand you. Because when the first week I arrived, we learned the social words like hello, how are you, thank you, I'm fine, and they have a whole lot of other little social cliches that they like to use. And if somebody's eating, they will say sahtain, which means literally double help. And I guess it's kind of like people that drink, and they click their glasses and say to your health or something like that. Well, they say this about eating. And so I saw some of the Arab students in the school of preaching we had over there, and I was going to say this word and be polite, and say the proper word. And I said saktain, but I didn't say sachtain. I didn't get it in the throat right. And one of them came running up to me and he said, "Do you know what you just said?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "May you have 2 strokes from God." So you got to get the words right. But the Hebrew word here, now that we're looking at, is hishtachawa. And it is that's the form that's used in the passages primarily that involve worship in the Old Testament. Now, one of these passages, we won't read all these, but one of these passages is Exodus 34 and verse 14. And like I say, these are found 170 times, so obviously we're not going to read them all. But Exodus 34:14, "Thou shalt worship no other God, for Jehovah, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." Now, this is, of course, in the material here following the giving of the 10 Commandments and the explanation of various and sundry other items that God wanted the Jews to observe now that He has led them out of Egypt and they've become a nation. And let's go back to Exodus 20, as a matter of fact, where the 10 Commandments were given. And notice in Exodus 20 and verse 5 that we have, let's see, Exodus 20 verse 5. I don't know why I'm looking at verse 12 here. Exodus 20 verse 5, "Thou shalt not bow down thyself unto them, nor serve them." Now here is an example where the translators took this same word, but instead of translating it worship, they translated it bow down, see? And so when you're reading the English, it may say bow down, or it may say worship, and yet it may be exactly the same word. And the idea is that there was a physical bowing down, but the word implies there's a spiritual bowing down, see? You don't always bow down. When you worship, you may stand and sing a song of worship to God, but you're mentally bowing down, see? And so that's why the word has a spiritual connotation that goes beyond what the physical element seems to imply. And so neither shalt thou bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. You see, it's a neither nor. There's 2 items that are mentioned here. And there's a distinction, therefore, drawn between worship and service. And over again, in the Old Testament, you have such words mentioned. As a matter of fact, in the Lectureship book that was produced here in 1983, my material in that book, I listed out 20 passages where idol worship was condemned. And here's what it would say, passages like this: "Neither worship them nor serve them. Serve them and worship them. Don't serve other gods and worship them. They went and served other gods and worshiped them." And you see, always it's the double expression seems to be found in so many passages. Don't worship them and don't serve them. And so, if you're inductively gathering evidence from Bible passages, and that's really what we've been doing this week in this study, because you don't have neat little definitions of worship, see? So you have to gather your evidence through an inductive, searchingly finding it in the Bible. And when you do that on this, and you see these over and over again, where this distinction is drawn, you have to finally conclude, I think, that there is a distinction between worship and service. Otherwise, why all the redundant expressions like this? And so that's the idea that I think is presented in the Old Testament very, very clearly. Don't worship them and don't serve them. And therefore there is a distinction between between worship and the performance of religious duties. Now that's the word hishtahawa. And then you have the word sagad or sagid. One is the Hebrew and the other the Aramaic form of that word. It's just found a few times in the Old Testament. I won't even give you any references on it. But let's move on to the New. In the New Testament, there is the word proskuneo. Now, those who studied Greek under the influence of Southern Baptists like to pronounce the omicron as an ah, and they will say proskuneo, Don. I've heard Roy Deaver do it many, many times over the years. But I claim that's Southern Baptist, and I don't want to have anything to do with that. And besides that, they got it from the Germans in the first place, and they got it wrong too. But that omicron means little o. Micron means little. Omicron, little o, and it's pronounced o. And if you go to Greece today, they will pronounce that letter just exactly like they pronounce the omega. And so that's why I say proskuneo, not proskuneo. But anyway, so much for the pronunciation. This word is in the New Testament, and it means, if you split it up, the pros means to or toward, and kuneo is the root word to kiss. And so to kiss toward, and the idea is you either kiss the hand of someone, or you kiss the foot, or you throw a kiss, or you kiss the ground before someone. And they did this, you see, with kings and high officials and this sort of thing. And so the word came to be used as the word, therefore, for worship, because you've got to have some word to indicate homage. You see, homage and submission and a bowing down and a giving of honor here. And so this is the word that is found in the New Testament, and it is an overt act. We mentioned the other night, you don't just do this 24 hours a day. It's not an ongoing attitude. It's rather an act. It can be purely a mental act. In other words, you might not sing a song. You might not word a prayer even, or do anything else. But you might simply in your mind say, thank God that this has turned out this way. Something in your life, you see, that's happened. Maybe a newborn baby or something. And you might just mentally think to yourself, thank the Lord for this, the mother and baby are doing fine. That's an act of worship, see? That's an act of worship. You weren't really praying, you weren't singing, you weren't saying anything, but you mentally bowed down, acknowledged the greatness of God, gave thanks to God, or something like this. And therefore, as I said last night, when people construct their little lists of items or acts of worship, I think sometimes they get very artificial. Let me interrupt my train of thought, since I just said that, and say something that I should have said perhaps last night. Do you know where people get their list of acts of worship? And when they say, well, it's preaching, it's singing, it's the Lord's Supper, and they list these out like that. They get it because they have assumed that Acts 2:42 contains all the lists of acts of worship. And you know the passage on the day of Pentecost, where they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and the fellowship and the breaking bread and the prayers. And people will work around every which way to try to get all the acts of worship in that one verse. And it never seems to have occurred to people that nowhere in the text there does it say these are acts of worship, or these are all the acts of worship, or anything like that. You see, it just says that's what the disciples were doing. And so to jump to a conclusion and say, well, this must be God's list of all the acts of worship, is to read something into the text that God never stated. And so I was writing to a brother the other day that I think is messed up on part of the concept of worship. And I said, I notice in your list of acts of worship, you left out inner adoration. And he wrote back and he said, well, I never saw inner adoration listed in anybody's list of acts of worship. And I thought, well, that's the problem. He's read too many brethren's lists, and he hasn't read the scriptures. And we read scriptures last night where in the mind and in the heart, you see, the heart and the soul is lifted up to God. Worship God in spirit, you see, and it's in the spirit. It's in the soul of man. Your spirit pants, your soul pants after God. That's what worship is. And that's the way the New Testament presents it. So, and also when people do something overt, like he fell down and worshiped. Well, the falling down alone is not worship, see? There has to be the mental activity. The mental activity is really where the worship is. He fell down and worshiped, and so he did it in his mind. And therefore, this proskuneo has to do with the mind. It's mentally throwing a kiss, you might say, toward God. That reminds me of a passage. Psalm 2 and verse 12. Psalm 2, verse 12. This is one that may be often overlooked. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and ye perish in the way, for his wrath will soon be kindled. Blessed are all they that take refuge in him. Now, see, a reference to Jesus, kiss the Son. Well, how are we going to do that? He's not here. We can't physically do that. You do it mentally. You see, it's a mental activity. And so, therefore, the inner adoration of the heart, the soul, the mind, this is where worship is centered. 59 times this word is found in the New Testament, and it corresponds to the Old Testament terms that we've already mentioned. And the New Testament speaks of wrongly offering such worship to Satan or to his allies, demons, idols. In fact, even God's own messengers, angels, don't worship them either. Then there's another word, sebomai, S-E-B-O-M-A-I, with some cognate related words, sebazomai, sebasma, and eusebeo. One of these, by the way, is found in Romans 1:25. Sebazomai, they worshipped and served the creature rather than the creator. And then you have threskeia and ethalothreskeia. And the second one of these two is will worship, as found in Colossians 2, where Paul mentioned will worship. And so this is another set of related words then that mean worship. Now that's all there is. That's all there is in the Old and the New Testament that properly mean worship. And I wanted to quote again from this first writer that I quoted from. And he said, the New Testament concept of worship is in no way restricted to any special acts, but rather encompasses the Christian's whole life offered as a sacrifice to God. Consequently, and by the way, he mentioned as his proof text, and we'll come back to this, Hebrews 12:1, Hebrews 12:28, and Hebrews 13:15 and 16. And he says, consequently, whatever he does should be performed as an act of worship to God's honor and glory. The popular 5 acts of worship idea is the result of reading back into the New Testament the traditional concept of the Christian assembly as a worship service. But both the concept itself and its embodiment in various expressions commonly used today in reference to the assembly, like the worship service, morning and evening worship, the worship hour, going to worship, where do you worship? These things, he says, are completely foreign to the New Testament. Here, he says, we recognize the influence of our Catholic and Protestant heritage. Now, I think that these 5 acts of worship, as has often been listed out by brethren, have missed the boat in a spot or two myself. But you see, that's not what he's saying. He's saying the whole idea of acts of worship that you could itemize, like singing, praying, that sort of thing. The whole idea is wrong. It's your total life, or your total relationship, your total service, and all of this is foreign to the New Testament. Now, the other night we mentioned the passages in the Bible that speak of going to worship and coming to worship, and they shall all come and worship you, it's even said in the New Testament age. And he says this is foreign to the New Testament. But it's in the Bible, you see. And so now here's where I think his mistake is. Now he told us where he thought our mistake was, that we got this from the Protestants and the Catholics. Here's where I think his mistake is. I think he started with a modern concept of worship, you see. And he looks at people in a liturgical style of worship, like the Catholics might have, this sort of thing. And then he's reading that back into the New Testament. Or he's doing it from the other direction. He's going back into the Old Testament, and he's looking at the liturgy there, if you want to call it that. He's looking at all of the ceremonial acts and this sort of thing, and he's pulling that into the New Testament. And so I think he's assumed that anything that's done in the Old Testament tabernacle is worship, number one. And then he's gotten these modern concepts, and he's coming at it from both directions. He's got liturgical style worship here, and he's got the same thing, this ceremonial thing here over in the tabernacle or temple, and he's reading that into the New Testament, and that's where he came up with some wrong conclusions. Now, after saying that, let me say this. There are Bible words for service. We mentioned Bible words for worship. There are Bible words for service. One of these in the Old Testament is sharat, S-H-A-R-A-T. And the corresponding term in the Greek, I know that if you're not familiar with these terms, you won't be able to write these down, but some of you are familiar, and that's why I'm mentioning it to you in case you want to write it down. The corresponding term in the Greek is liturgeo. Liturgeo. L-E-I-T-O-U-R-G-E-O. And this word sharat in the religious sense refers to participation, or refers to particularly, is what I'm trying to say, to the ritualistic duties of priests and Levites in the tabernacle or the temple. And it is usually rendered minister in the King James Version. So-and-so went into the tabernacle and ministered. You see, Aaron or his sons or whoever it might be. Exodus 28 and verse 35 is a reference you might want to jot down on that. And there is a reference I want us to look at in particular in this regard, and that is Exodus 33 and verse 10. And all the people saw the pillar of cloud stand at the door of the tent, and all the people rose up and worshiped, every man at his tent door. Now, that's in Exodus 33 and verse 10, and it has the word worship, you see. Every man worshiped at his tent door. But now, if you were to back up to Exodus 28 and 35, which I mentioned a moment ago, let's see here, if I can read this without my glasses. And it shall be upon Aaron to minister, and the sound thereof shall be heard when he goeth in unto the holy place before Jehovah, and when he cometh out, that he die not. All right, he's the high priest, and he's ministering in there, you see. And so the priests are ministering in the tabernacle, but every Israelite is worshiping. There's a distinction here. The priests are ministering or serving, and all the people are worshiping. Now here, I want to go to another passage that is really telling, I think. Numbers 16 and verse 9, which speaks of the priests serving the congregation. Here's what it says. We're kind of jumping into the middle of a sentence. Well, let me back up one verse and we won't. And Moses said unto Korah, Hear now, ye sons of Levi. So he's speaking to the Levites, see? Hear now, ye sons of Levi, seemeth it but a small thing unto you that the God of Israel hath separated you from the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself, to do the service of the tabernacle of Jehovah, and to stand before the congregation to minister unto them. Now, they're ministering all right, they're serving. Now, what the word I'm reading here in the Hebrew is one of the words that our friend here, who's written the article that I've been quoting, this series of articles, he says this is one of these worship words in the Old Testament, and the corresponding New Testament word is worship. Well, wait a minute. If it means worship, well, who were they worshiping? Listen to what the text says. They stand before the congregation to, let's translate it worship, to worship them. See? It says to minister unto them in the King James Version. So if minister means to worship, and the minister here means serve, you know. And so if the serving, the ministering means worship, then the priests were worshiping the people. See? And so that would go to show you right there that something is really out of whack in these people's concept of what these words for service really mean. Now, the New Testament part of this, the liturgeo, which is the verb form, or liturgia, which is the noun form, it comes from, if we were to split it down into its root parts, from the word laos, meaning people, and ergon, meaning work, and so it is work for the people, public service. Like we talk about public servants who are elected office, or anybody working in civil service, that kind of thing. And this word, exclusively in the New Testament, describes priestly ritual. And so here you have the word used for priests, both in the New Testament and in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. Now, over in 2 Chronicles chapter 35, I want you to notice this. 2 Chronicles 35, the Greek translation of the Old Testament used this very word, and it has the corresponding Hebrew word that we just mentioned a moment ago in this passage. We're going to look at verse 3. And he said unto the Levites that taught all Israel that were holy unto Jehovah, put the holy ark in the house which Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, did build. There shall no more be a burden upon your shoulders. Now serve Jehovah your God and his people Israel. Serve God and Israel. All right? So let's take the basic premise now that we're being told here that service means worship. Worship God and Israel. See? It just won't work. It won't work. And long as we're looking at these passages that won't do, let's look at one out of the book of Ezekiel, chapter 44 and verse 11. Ezekiel 44 and verse 11. Yet they shall be ministers in my sanctuary, having oversight at the gates of the house, and ministering in the house. They shall slay the burnt offering and the sacrifice for the people, and they shall stand before them to minister unto them. Now, you see, it's the same thing. Here are the priests ministering unto the people. They're serving, they're standing before them, ministering unto them. Let me give you a modern day example of this. Here we are in the church now, and it's Sunday morning. And some men walk up to the front and stand behind the Lord's Supper table. And they take those trays and they go and start passing them out. Those men aren't worshiping in doing that. See? That's an act of service. Now, as the man is standing there and he's holding the tray for somebody, and here's a person partaking, if he's doing it rightly, discerning the body of Christ as he's supposed to, and the body and blood of the Lord, well then he's worshiping. The partaker is worshiping, but the man who's standing there, his concern is to get the trays passed out. And when he finally gets to the back, he may stop then at that place and do it himself. Or maybe did it before he ever started walking out there. And so there's a difference between the worship and the service. There's service going on and worship going on at the same time. And it's just like the Old Testament priests. They're ministering, they're serving in the tabernacle or the temple, but the individual offerer, if he's doing it rightly and offering his sacrifice and has in his heart this mental submission and approach to God, he's the one who's worshiping, not that priest. Now you see, look what it does to the concept of what these fellows are saying. They took the priests of the Old Testament and they said, this is the groundwork on which we move into the New Testament and find out that we are all priests and therefore everything we do is worship. But wait a minute, they missed the boat. You see where they missed it? Everything the priest did in the Old Testament wasn't worship. They started with the wrong premise. See? Those fellows were serving. They weren't worshiping in that tabernacle. Serving God. Now, they had their own individual worship if they were faithful Israelites. But when they were laying out the table of showbread and lighting the candles and doing all that, they were simply doing these service duties that they were obliged to do. And if you were to turn over to Hebrews 9, you would read some of them mentioned there. And the word is service. If you look at Hebrews 9:1, there is service. And by the way, there's no word for divine. If you're reading the King James and you read about divine service in verse 1, no word for divine in the Greek text. Translators put it in. I don't know that makes a lot of difference, but maybe some, by the use of that word, thought that meant worship, you see. And I think they would have been better off just to say service. But anyway, this is where the thing has gone wrong. They've started with the wrong premise, and they've reached the wrong conclusion. Now, in the Greek, we have the word abad, and I shouldn't have said Greek, that's Hebrew. We have the word abad, and you pronounce it that way with the throat. It kind of sounds like you're being strangled. And when the letter on there, if you ever read transliterated Hebrew words where they put them in English letters, and they put if I had a board here, they put an apostrophe with curved this way, that stands for the Hebrew letter ayin, and you have to do it like that to get the sound out. And kind of constrict your throat. That's what it stands for. And so the word abad is the primary word for service in the Old Testament. And the noun is abodah. And this means work or serve. And it's directed toward things, it's directed toward people, it's directed toward God, depending on the context of what you're talking about. And so this kind of service may include worship. You see, it's a general word, service. So it may include some worship items, but the word itself doesn't mean worship. It's a much broader word than just worship. And so it's used of service by the priests and by the people. And the corresponding term in the Greek, then, is latruo. And this comes from the word latron, which is wages, or latris, which means a servant or a hireling. And the word originally meant to work for wages. Later it came to mean just work in general. And this is a word that these writers, these fellows and different ones in the church now, are saying this word means worship. And they're coming to New Testament passages where it's found, and they're saying it means worship. This is the Greek word that the Greek translators of the Septuagint used to translate that word that we already noticed in Numbers 16:9, which says, serve God and the people. And so if it means worship, then it meant worship the people. Well, you know what happened when in the New Testament time somebody tried to worship a person, a man. I mean, what did Peter say when somebody tried to worship him? Remember Cornelius? Stand up, I'm a man. And so he wouldn't accept it. Or what about John when he tried to worship an angel? See? Don't worship me, worship God. I'm a fellow servant with you, he said. Worship God. He wouldn't accept it. And so if latruo here means worship, just like proskuneo, the word in the Greek that properly does mean worship, then Numbers 16 verse 9 has Moses telling the Levites to worship the people, and that's human beings, and that's idolatry or worse, and certainly cannot be right. Now, let me tell you, when you look up this sort of thing in reference works, if you were to consult Bible dictionaries, Bible encyclopedias, commentaries, you may be misled on this, because I've searched a lot of them, and I found all kinds of contradictory statements in there. And one will say this, and another one will say that, and as you keep reading more and more of these and looking to see what they're saying, you find that they don't agree among themselves. And that kind of makes me inclined to want to repeat what Johnny Ramsey's been known to say in the past, and that is that the Bible sheds a lot of light on these commentaries. Not the other way around sometimes. And so you can't go by what some of those books will tell you. The New Testament does maintain a distinction between worship and service. Paul said he went to worship at Jerusalem, but he was serving God night and day. And so you see, go to worship at some particular time, some particular place, or whatever. I mean, it could be any place, but it has to be done on a particular occasion. I mean, it's not 24 hours nonstop. Now, after saying all of that, let me go to the favorite passage that people who try to make all service be worship want to go to, and that is Romans 12:1 and 2. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your... Now here's where the translations differ. King James says reasonable service. I want to tell you right now, I believe the King James got it exactly right.
Amen.
Reasonable service. Number one, see, I use the American Standard. That's what I've got right here. I mean, this is my basic study Bible, but I always have the King James there, you know, and do the comparison and so forth. At least I try to do that. The American Standard, I believe, all in all, taken as a whole, is more accurate than the King James. But I believe they missed it in Hebrews 12:1, and some other passages too. I haven't found a perfect translation yet. King James has some errors in it too. Here they said spiritual service in this translation. And if you were to consult some others, they would say spiritual worship. And they've missed two words if they've done that. The word is not spiritual. It is not the Greek word for spiritual. It is the word that means reasonable to the mind. And that's why the King James is right. If you look it up in a lexicon, that's what they'll tell you it means. And the word here, it's not worship, it is service. It is that word latreia that we've been talking about here right at the end. And so this is the passage, you see, the prime passage that people like to go to in order to try to prove their point. Now, the first writer that I was mentioning here, he said this. He said, Romans 12:1 serves as the best definition of Christian worship. And the second writer, I think it was, that I quoted, said it may be the most significant passage for a clear and adequate understanding of Christian worship. But when you look up the word and you find out what it means, it doesn't speak of living a life of constant worship. It's talking about service, not worship, you see, and that's where the thing has gone wrong. The subject here, by the way, is sanctification, and those of you that have studied Romans know that there's a major division in the book right here between the first 11 chapters and the rest of the book. And so, based on everything that Paul has said up to this point, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice. Well, a day by day, everything you do. Take care of those bodies, keep them holy, keep them pure, and this is your service to God. But he didn't say it was worship. So he's talking about living a sanctified life. Don't go out here and commit fornication. Don't tear down this body and destroy it with drugs, alcohol, tobacco, or what have you. Take care of the body. And Paul is simply expanding on a point that he has made a little bit earlier in here. That's why he said therefore, because this isn't even the first time that he's brought this up, and based on some things he said earlier about how that we're saved and what therefore we should be as a result of that. If you were to go back to chapter 6 here, in Romans chapter 6, some of his readers were not fully converted. They went through a form of conversion without a full consecration, and that's why Paul said in Romans 6 verse 1, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Some of his readers were inclined to want to do that. They said, well, look, we've been saved. Doesn't matter what you do with the body. It's only the spirit of the soul that counts, and we can go out here and sin, and besides, God's grace will cover us anyway. I heard about one of our brethren preaching on a particular occasion, and he was one of these that really appealed to the younger generation. They just really took in everything he said and accepted it, I guess, as scripture. And after his sermon was over, a young man walked up to him, and he was overheard by someone else, and that's how I got the story. And the young man said to him, he said, a few years ago, he said, I was living a very terrible life. He said, I had become a Christian, but I'd fallen into drugs, alcohol, illicit sex, and just about anything you can think of, and I did it. And he said, I want to know what would have happened to me if I had died in that condition. And this preacher said God would have grabbed you up in his arms like one of his little lost children and taken you on home to heaven to be with him. Grace of God will cover everything, see? Yeah, supposedly. So, you see, that's the problem Paul was facing. That's the problem Paul was facing. Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. And he says that won't do. And so he comes down to verse 6 and he says, knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be done away, so we should no longer be in bondage to sin. And then after saying that, we could jump down and pick up another point in this procedure in verse 12 and 13. Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that ye should obey the lusts thereof. Neither present your members, King James says yield, your members unto sin as instruments of unrighteousness, but present yourselves unto God as alive from the dead, and your members, you see, as instruments of righteousness unto God. And then finally he gets down to verse 19, and he says, for as ye presented your members as servants to uncleanness and to iniquity, unto iniquity, even so now present your members as servants to righteousness, unto sanctification. You see, that's what he wants them to live, a sanctified life. But some of these people didn't get the point maybe the first time, and so Paul repeats it over in verse 12. I beseech you therefore, brethren, after he said some more things, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And be not fashioned according to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And so he's saying you present yourself. And those of you that have studied Greek, this is the aorist tense. It's a completed one-time action in the past. You present yourself once and for all, he's saying, to the Lord. And be a living sacrifice. And having once been truly converted, then, a person should offer service well-pleasing to God with reverence and awe. Hebrews 12:28. Now, you see, that's service. And that You're going to worship in the process of living that life of service, but that's the difference between worship and service. Now let me say one thing right now and we'll close. And that is, what is the importance of noticing this? Is it really important? Does it matter if some brethren say all you do in service is worship? Are we making a mountain out of a molehill to even worry about it? No, because there is a kind of a logical progression of error that can take place. I heard a brother at Abilene during a lectureship, it's probably been 15 years ago now, and he said essentially the same thing that some of these others were saying, and he said, I want to tell you that your dinner table is just as sacred as the so-called Lord's table, and the Lord's table is just as secular as your dinner table. Well, the Bible says to make a distinction between the sacred and the profane. Profane meaning common. Between that which is holy and that which is common. We're to distinguish the things that differ. And when a person doesn't do that, and he thinks that everything in life is worship, well, then he's going to think, you know, if it's all right for me to sit at the piano and play Home, Home on the Range, then why couldn't I get the church songbook out and put it up there? And why couldn't I do that there? And if I could do it there, and if everything you do in life is worship, you see, I'm worshiping when I'm singing Home, Home on the Range. So therefore I'm worshiping if I sit and sing and play How Great Thou Art, and therefore what difference would it make if you brought it into the assembly? You see, there's no basis on which to draw any distinctions at all. If everything you do in life is worship. And therefore you're going to have one big conglomeration, everything's worship, and so you can do anything and everything and call it worship, and it'll be acceptable to God. And you could therefore not only have a piano in the assembly, you could have a full orchestra, or you could do anything else you wanted to do. Anything you wanted to invent and bring it in would be acceptable. See? That's the bottom line of why this is important. Well, thank you for your kind attention. And our time's up, and one more night on this subject and we'll be finished.
Excellent.